video, I'm going over the stencil project in preparation for the Japanese textile workshop with Brian Whitehead. And he has sent us in our homework kit 4 of the persimmon stencil paper. The teacher has provided 2 squares and 2 circles. And what our task is to come up with stencil designs that will coordinate. We're going to print them all together on a kimono size fabric as shown in the photograph on screen right now. That's an example. Notice how there's 4 different bird designs, 2 in circles and 2 in squares, that are related, and so we'll be alternating those designs. Now I have worked out my designs for the stencils on paper. I did it on the computer, but if you don't have computer skills, don't worry about that. Just go ahead and draw something up. I suggest grid paper. Grid paper is really easy to use, and you would do these in a 4-inch square or a 4-inch circle and just work out your stencil design. And if it's messy, just trace over it to get the final. The important thing to remember when you're doing a stencil design is to make sure that you've added little, what we call connectors or bridges, so that the stencil doesn't have loose pieces. Everything needs to be interconnected. So I actually suggest maybe making a photocopy of this paper and cutting it out first to make sure everything's working correctly before you tackle the actual stencil paper. This paper is very expensive, but if you make a mistake, don't worry, bring it to Japan anyway, because they can be mended if a piece falls off or is loose. There's a way that we can patch it when we get there. So I'm going to first just cut out one of my designs. I'll start with a square, and I'm going to use a glue stick to adhere it to my stencil paper. So the best, if you can line it up very straight, that's helpful, because we'll actually use these pieces of paper as our guideline to match up the designs. It'll print something like this. Something like that. So when you imagine your finished design, you would get a repeating pattern of the circles and squares. So using a glue stick, I'm going to just make sure it has pretty good coverage. You want to make sure it's thoroughly covered so that it sticks to the paper, up to the stencil paper. And then put it on there straight. Burnish it. You can use any kind of flat surface to give it a nice adhesion. And then I'm going to use the number 11 X-Acto blade. I like these the best because I'm used to using these. I've used them for decades, but I like the X-Acto because it's got a nice long point. The teacher has also provided knives from Japan, which have this shorter knife, and they work just as well, but it's just my personal preference to use X-Acto. And then I'm going to just, in this case, because I have straight lines, I'm going to use a ruler to cut my straight lines. I'm cutting out the black part and leaving the white part. So I'm going to start this way. I want to be able to see what I'm doing. So I'm just going to cut. And it might take 2 cuts to go through, so you want to take your time. So you can see I have to go back in and kind of make sure I've cut to the very corners. But you don't want to overcut, because that will create some open seams that the rice paper paste might go through. So what we're going to be doing when we go to Japan is our instructor will teach us how to mount these to like, basically it's like a screen, like a silk screen, metal fine mesh green. And then we're going to actually use a rice paste to, kind of like a silk screening process, use the rice paste to print like a block out onto our fabric. So it's usually a red or brown color, and it becomes a resist. And then after that dries, then we dip it in the indigo dye, and then eventually we rinse off the rice paste. And where we see black on my stencil, it's going to be, that's where the rice paper is going to go. It's going to block it out. So those actually, everything that's black will be white, the color of the fabric on the spray piece, and everything that's white will turn to the indigo blue. Let's see. I'm having to go in by hand to do these little parts. They're kind of hard to do with the ruler, but let's try it one more time. And when you finish each area, you can just punch out the little pieces and then continue on. And the curves can just be done freehand. I think because my shape has curves, I'm going to just do it by hand. So you can see that's starting to come together, and these little bridges help keep this middle part intact. If I didn't have this sort of heart shape would just fall out. So try to remember to put bridges everywhere that you can, and it just becomes part of the natural design. So I finished cutting the first stencil, and some of my connectors were too thin. Mine are like a 32nd of an inch or a 16th of an inch. I would suggest keeping them more like an 1/8 of an inch, because I have a issue here. Now I'll be able to repair that when we do adhere these to the mesh, but ideally you wouldn't have any broken pieces. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and just cut out my other 3 designs, and I'm going to glue them to my stencil paper. Get these all lined up. I want to make sure that this is straight and perpendicular with the edge of the paper. And I'm just going to use my glue stick generously. Line it up. And this is very forgiving. You can move it around, slide it around a little bit before you burnish it. And that looks pretty good. I'm going to use the grid lines on my cutting mat to line it up. And that looks pretty good. And I'm going to burnish it. And just go ahead and do all 4 while I have my glue stick out. I'm using the lines on my mat to align these. You could also measure it with a ruler and just make little tick marks. And be sure to change your blade frequently. I don't recommend using 1 blade for the whole thing. I use 2 or 3 blades per stencil so that I have nice and sharp tip. Especially if you break the tip off, you're going to want to change the blade. So I'll continue cutting these now, and I'll show you the final result. I've finished cutting my 4 stencils. So I have 2 4-inch square designs and 2 4-inch round designs. And I'm just going to simply use the tip of my knife to remove the excess paper that I used as a pattern. Now you can draw directly on your stencil paper if you prefer, if maybe you're doing something a little more loose and organic. So I'm just going to carefully take all this off. So I finished removing my paper pattern, and I did unfortunately break a couple of my bridges, my connectors. So I'm going to just take some low tack tape and just patch it for now. When we adhere these to the mesh screens, we can actually cheat a little bit and glue in pieces that are falling apart. So if you have this problem, just be sure to secure all your pieces so you don't lose them. And then I'm going to, I cut out some chipboard, and I'm going to just lay these on the chipboard. Let's see, I put the one with the tape I'll put down, and then on my second chipboard, this is the one, this one's pretty good. This one has a couple broken pieces. Yeah, I may have to do these over again, but so I highly recommend that you make your connectors at least 1/8 of an inch, and then just be very, very careful when you're removing your pattern. So that's it. I'm going to pack them in cardboard and bring them to the workshop, and we'll go from there. So I've secured my stencils to cardboard, and where I had a couple broken bridges, I just used some low tack tape. Those can be patched when we glue it to the mesh. So you just want to be able to make sure that you put some paper in between, and then store it into, say, an envelope and something very compact and stiff. And so I'm going to end this video with some inspiration for both traditional Japanese stencils as well as some modern interpretations. And I'll show, so just browse through some of the examples and come up with your own unique designs. And I'll see you in Fujino, Japan.